I stood in the hallway outside conference room B, my laptop still warm in my hands, watching through the glass as Director Helen Voss took my seat at the negotiation table. She didn't look back. She'd just pulled me from the biggest deal of my career at Point Technologies, a partnership with Westford Industries worth $43 million, because, in her words, I cared too much about fairness. Let me back up. My name is Claudia Rangers, and I'd been Point Technologies' senior negotiator for 6 years. 6 years of closed deals, satisfied clients, and a reputation for building partnerships that actually lasted. Point Technologies manufactured precision components for aerospace and medical devices, the kind of work where quality mattered more than speed, where relationships meant everything. The company had been founded 32 years ago by Margaret Brennan and Carl Foster, two engineers who believed that excellence required patience. They'd built Point Technologies on principles of precision manufacturing and ethical partnerships. When they retired 5 years back, they'd sold to an investment group that promised to maintain those values. For the most part, they had. But new leadership meant new pressures, new metrics, new people who didn't always understand what made Point Technologies special. I loved that job. I loved the puzzle of finding terms that worked for everyone, the satisfaction of shaking hands knowing both sides felt respected. Maybe that makes me naive. Helen certainly thought so. The Westford deal had landed on my desk 3 months earlier. Westford wanted to become Point Technologies' exclusive supplier for titanium alloy components, a massive commitment that would reshape our entire supply chain. The contract negotiations were complex, involving quality standards, delivery schedules, pricing tiers, and liability clauses that could make or break either company if things went wrong. Westford Industries operated 3 manufacturing facilities across the Midwest, employed over 800 people, and had spent the last decade building a reputation for aerospace-grade materials. Their CEO, Marjorie Kelton, had personally reached out to Stanley Crawford to propose the partnership. She believed our companies shared compatible values around quality and long-term thinking. That initial conversation had been promising enough that Stanley assigned me to lead negotiations. I'd spent 12 weeks in discussions with Westford's team, led by their VP of Operations, Gordon Fletcher. Gordon was old school, methodical, detail-oriented, and deeply invested in making sure his company wasn't left vulnerable. He'd been with Westford for 18 years, had worked his way up from production manager, and knew every aspect of their operation intimately. We'd built a good working relationship. He trusted me. Our early meetings had been productive. We'd toured Westford's primary facility in Ohio, where I'd seen firsthand the precision of their quality control processes. Their rejection rate for defective titanium alloys was less than 0.3%, extraordinary in the industry. Gordon had introduced me to their metallurgy team, walked me through their testing protocols, and shared proprietary data that demonstrated their capabilities. In return, I'd been transparent about Point Technologies' needs, our production schedules, and the technical specifications our aerospace clients required. By week 6, we'd roughed out the basic framework. Westford would supply titanium components according to specifications we'd developed jointly. Delivery schedules would align with our production cycles, with buffer inventory to prevent disruptions. Pricing would use a tiered structure based on volume, with annual reviews tied to market indices. Quality standards would exceed industry minimums, with shared inspection protocols and right of refusal clauses for both parties. It was good work. Solid work. The kind of agreement that could run for a decade with minimal friction. But Helen Voss had other ideas. Helen had joined Point Technologies 8 months before as our new Director of Strategic Partnerships. She came from a consulting background, all sharp suits and sharper tactics. Her previous firm, Stratton Advisory, was known for aggressive cost-cutting and what they called value optimization. Stanley had hired her to modernize our partnership approach, to bring what he called fresh thinking to our negotiations. Her philosophy was simple: extract maximum value, minimize commitments, and never leave money on the table. She loved talking about leverage and positioning. In her first week, she'd given a presentation to the senior team about competitive negotiation tactics that made my stomach turn. Every slide showed zero-sum thinking, how to pressure suppliers, how to exploit dependency, how to structure deals that locked partners into disadvantageous terms. We clashed from day one. The first real conflict came during week 3 of the Westford negotiations. I'd drafted a clause that protected both companies if raw material costs fluctuated dramatically, a standard provision that acknowledged market realities and built in fair adjustments. Titanium prices were notoriously volatile, influenced by everything from mining output to aerospace demand to geopolitical factors. A good contract anticipated that volatility and created mechanisms for reasonable adjustments rather than forcing either party to absorb catastrophic cost changes. Helen read it and laughed. "Why are we giving them an out?" she asked, tapping the page with one manicured fingernail. "Lock them in. If titanium prices spike, that's their problem." "It's also our problem if they go under or breach the contract," I replied. "This keeps everyone stable. If Westford faces unsustainable losses, they'll either break the agreement or cut corners on quality. Neither outcome serves us." She looked at me like I'd suggested we just hand Westford cash. "Claudia, you're negotiating, not making friends. Push harder." I didn't push harder. I believed in the clause, and Gordon's team appreciated it. They'd actually proposed similar language independently, which confirmed we were thinking along the same lines. But Helen started attending my check-in meetings, offering guidance that felt more like interference. She wanted shorter payment terms that would strain Westford's cash flow. She wanted penalty clauses so severe they'd bankrupt a supplier for a single late delivery. She wanted everything tilted so far in Point Technology's favor that no reasonable partner would sign. "They need us more than we need them," Helen kept saying. "Use that." But here's the thing, she was wrong. Yes, this was a significant deal for Westford. Becoming our exclusive titanium supplier would represent roughly 35% of their annual revenue, a substantial commitment. But Point Technologies needed reliable suppliers just as desperately. Our previous titanium supplier, Consolidated Metals, had gone bankrupt the year before after mismanaging their debt, leaving us scrambling. We'd spent 4 months sourcing materials from 3 different vendors, dealing with inconsistent quality and supply chain chaos. Production delays had cost us 2 major contracts. Our aerospace clients had been furious. Westford offered stability, quality, and capacity. This wasn't about domination, it was about partnership. Both companies needed this deal to work, which meant both companies needed terms they could live with long term. I tried explaining this to Helen multiple times. She'd nod, say she understood, then send me emails at midnight with suggestions that undermined everything I'd built with Westford's team. She wanted me to demand 6-month payment terms instead of the standard 30 days. She wanted unlimited inspection rights that would let us shut down Westford's facilities at will. She wanted termination clauses that allowed us to cancel with 0 notice while binding Westford to 5-year commitments. "These are standard aggressive negotiation tactics," she told me in one particularly frustrating meeting. "Every Fortune 500 company operates this way." "We're not a Fortune 500 company," I countered. "We're a precision manufacturer that depends on trust relationships. Our clients stay with us because we're reliable and ethical. That reputation extends to how we treat partners." "Sentiment doesn't close deals," Helen said dismissively. "Leverage does." By month 2, Gordon was getting frustrated. He'd pull me aside after meetings and ask, "Claudia, what's going on? These new terms don't match what we discussed. Last week you agreed to standard payment schedules, but now I'm seeing demands for 6-month terms. That's not workable for our cash flow." I couldn't tell him my own director was sabotaging negotiations. Professional loyalty and chain of command prevented me from openly criticizing Helen to external partners. I'd smile and say we were working through internal alignment, that I'd clarify terms in our next draft. I'd stay up late drafting compromise language, trying to satisfy Helen while keeping Gordon at the table. It was like being pulled in opposite directions by 2 horses. I started documenting everything. Every email from Helen. Every change she demanded. Every meeting where I'd explained why certain terms were unreasonable. I told myself it was just good practice, professional thoroughness. Deep down, I knew I was building a defense file. The stress was affecting me. I wasn't sleeping well. I'd lost 7 pounds. My partner, Chris, kept asking if I was okay. I'd say yes, then spend evenings staring at contract drafts, trying to find magic language that would thread an impossible needle. It was exhausting. Then came the liability section. This was the deal-breaker territory, who bore responsibility if components failed in the field. Given that our parts went into aircraft and surgical equipment, the stakes were genuinely life and death. A failed component in a passenger jet or a surgical robot could mean casualties, lawsuits, regulatory investigations, and criminal charges. Both companies carried substantial insurance, but insurance only covered so much. The contract needed to establish clear liability frameworks that aligned responsibility with actual fault. This wasn't theoretical. There were real-world cases where supplier disputes over liability had bankrupted companies or resulted in executives facing criminal charges. I proposed a shared liability model based on root cause analysis. If failure stemmed from manufacturing defects on Westford's end, improper alloy composition, inadequate heat treatment, contamination during production, they'd bear costs. If it came from design flaws in point technology specifications, poor integration, or misuse of materials, we'd cover it. Independent third-party analysis would determine fault. Fair. Reasonable. Standard practice in high-stakes manufacturing. Helen wanted Westford to assume all liability, period. That's insane, I told her in her office, trying to keep my voice level. No supplier would ever agree to that. We'd be asking them to stake their entire company on our designs. If we specify an application that's outside the material's tolerances and something fails, Westford gets destroyed while we walk away? That's not a partnership. That's exploitation. Then they can walk away, Helen said, not looking up from her phone. Someone else will take the deal. No one else has Westford's capacity or quality certifications. We've already vetted them. Their facilities are aerospace certified, their processes are audited and proven, and their quality metrics exceed anyone else we've evaluated. Starting over would cost us 6 months minimum and millions in delayed production while we vet alternatives. She finally looked at me. You care too much about fairness, Claudia. This is business. They'll accept our terms because they have to. They've already invested 3 months in these negotiations. They won't walk away now over liability language. Yes, they will. Gordon's team has explicitly flagged unlimited liability as a non-starter. Their CFO, William Tate, reviewed our initial proposal and was comfortable with shared liability based on fault determination. If we demand they assume all liability, including for our mistakes, they'll terminate negotiations. Tate has already said their board won't approve any agreement that creates existential risk. Helen waved a hand dismissively. People always say things are non-negotiable until you push. Trust me. They'll cave. I didn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about Gordon's team, the good faith they'd shown, the hours we'd invested in building something sustainable. I thought about Point Technologies workers, whose jobs depended on reliable supply chains, not scorched earth negotiation tactics. I thought about what Margaret Brennan and Carl Foster would say if they saw how their company's values were being compromised. The next morning, I drafted a memo to Helen and our CEO, Stanley Crawford. I laid out my concerns. The liability terms were unreasonable, Westford was likely to walk, and we'd lose a critical partnership over ego and aggressive positioning. I attached financial projections showing what losing this deal would cost us. Conservative estimates suggested $8 million in lost production efficiency, potential contract penalties from aerospace clients, and 18 months minimum to establish an alternative supplier relationship. I referenced Westford's explicit warnings about liability terms. I cited 3 industry examples where similar aggressive tactics had destroyed partnerships and damaged the aggressor's reputation. It was a strong memo. Clear, factual, well-supported. I hit send before I could second-guess myself. Stanley never responded. Helen called me into her office within an hour. I don't appreciate being undermined, she said coldly. You report to me. If I want your opinion on strategy, I'll ask for it. Copying Stanley on internal disagreements makes you look unprofessional and disloyal. This isn't about loyalty, I said, working to keep my voice steady. This is about protecting Point Technologies from a catastrophic mistake. We're about to lose a $43 million partnership because you're too soft, she interrupted. You think negotiation is about everyone holding hands and singing songs. It's about winning. It's about making sure Point Technologies gets maximum value and minimum risk. And if you can't do that, maybe you're in the wrong role. The threat was clear. Comply or be replaced. My hands were shaking when I left her office. Was I wrong? Was I really too focused on fairness? Had my 6 years at Point Technologies made me complacent, too comfortable with collaborative approaches that wouldn't work in a more competitive environment? I called my mentor, a retired negotiator named Paula Whitmore, who'd trained me when I first started. Paula had spent 30 years closing deals across multiple industries. She'd seen every tactic, survived every pressure, and had eventually left corporate life because, in her words, I got tired of watching people confuse cruelty with competence. Fairness isn't weakness, Paula told me when I explained the situation. It's sustainability. Deals built on exploitation fall apart. You know this. You've seen it happen. Remember the Denton medical contract? I did remember. 3 years ago, one of our competitors had strong-armed a medical device supplier into accepting punitive terms. The supplier had signed under duress, then immediately began looking for alternative buyers. Within 18 months, they'd sold to a larger company that had no interest in honoring disadvantageous contracts. The agreement was terminated, litigation followed, and both companies lost millions. Helen's approach might work short-term, Paula continued. But in 5 years, Point Technologies will have a reputation as a predatory partner. Good suppliers will avoid you. You'll be left with desperate companies that have no alternatives, which means poor quality and unstable relationships. I knew she was right. But knowing and surviving were different things. The final negotiation session was scheduled for a Thursday. I'd spent the week preparing, trying one last time to find language that would satisfy Helen's demands while keeping Westford engaged. I'd drafted 3 versions of the liability clause, each one progressively more favorable to Point Technologies while still maintaining some semblance of balance. I'd scheduled a pre-meeting with Gordon to walk through the options, hoping to find creative solutions. I arrived early that morning, set up the conference room, and reviewed my notes. I'd prepared talking points for every objection Helen might raise. I had data showing why shared liability was industry standard. I had examples of successful partnerships built on mutual responsibility. I was ready. That's when Helen appeared. She called me into conference room B 15 minutes before Westford's team was scheduled to arrive. Her expression was set, determined. "I'm taking over the negotiation," she announced. I stared at her. "What? You've had 3 months. You're too focused on making everyone comfortable instead of closing." "I'm finishing this today. Helen, Gordon's team trusts me. We've built a relationship over 12 weeks. If you suddenly replace me, it'll signal that something's wrong, that we're not negotiating in good faith." "They'll adapt," she cut me off. "This is business. Leadership changes happen. You care too much about fairness. It's clouding your judgment. You're not thinking about Point Technology's best interests. Step aside." I wanted to argue. I wanted to refuse. I wanted to march straight to Stanley's office and force him to intervene. But she was my director, and Stanley hadn't backed me up. He'd ignored my memo, which sent a clear message about whose judgment he trusted. What choice did I have? So I stepped aside. I stood in that hallway, my carefully prepared materials still in my laptop bag, watching through the glass as Westford's team arrived. Gordon saw Helen at the head of the table instead of me. His expression shifted, confusion, then concern. He looked around, spotted me through the window, and his face fell. I saw him mouth something to his colleague, William Tate. Both men looked troubled. I couldn't hear what was being said, but I could read body language. Helen was pushing hard, leaning forward, gesturing emphatically. She'd brought a revised contract, one I hadn't seen, and she was walking through terms page by page. Gordon's team kept exchanging glances. Their attorney, a woman named Carol Zimmerman, started taking aggressive notes, underlining passages with angry strokes. William Tate's expression grew progressively darker. Within 30 minutes, I saw Gordon stand up and gather his materials. Tate followed immediately. Carol was still writing, documenting what was probably being said. Helen appeared to be trying to de-escalate, holding up placating hands, but Gordon shook his head firmly. He said something brief, picked up his briefcase, and walked toward the door. They were walking out. I stepped away from the window before they exited, not wanting to witness the full collapse or put Gordon in the awkward position of having to acknowledge me. I went back to my office, closed the door, and tried to figure out what to do next. Update my resume? Call a lawyer? Just quit? My phone buzzed. A text from Gordon, "I'm sorry this happened. You deserved better." That almost broke me. Not anger at Helen. Not fury at Stanley. But kindness from the partner we'd just destroyed. I sat there for hours, replaying everything. Every meeting. Every compromise I'd crafted. Every warning I'd given. Every moment I'd known this was heading toward disaster but hadn't been able to stop it. 4 days later, Helen stormed into my office without knocking. "Why did the deal fall apart?" she shouted. I looked up slowly from my computer, where I'd been drafting my resignation letter. "I'm sorry?" "Westford. They sent a termination letter this morning. They're walking away from the entire partnership. They cited fundamental incompatibility in business philosophy and unwillingness to enter agreements based on mutual exploitation." "Why didn't you warn me they were this fragile?" "Fragile. That's what she called a company that wouldn't accept one-sided, punitive terms. That's what she called 800 employees whose livelihoods depended on ethical partnerships." "I did warn you," I said quietly, working to control the anger rising in my chest. "Multiple times. In meetings, in memos, in that email I sent to you and Stanley 3 weeks ago. You said I cared too much about fairness. You said they'd accept our terms because they had to." Her face flushed. "I didn't think they'd actually walk." Gordon seemed invested. "They'd spent 3 months on this. Walking away means they get nothing. They get their integrity," I said. "They get to avoid a partnership that would have destroyed them the first time we made a mistake and blamed them for it. They get to preserve their reputation instead of becoming known as the company that accepted exploitative terms out of desperation." "This is your fault," Helen hissed, stepping closer to my desk. "You poisoned the relationship with all your soft negotiating. They expected weakness, and when I showed strength, they couldn't handle it. You set them up to see reasonable business terms as aggressive because you'd coddled them for 3 months." I stood up. All the restraint, all the professionalism that had kept me silent for months, it evaporated. "No. You showed aggression, not strength. There's a difference." Gordon's team was ready to sign a fair deal. They'd said yes to everything except unlimited liability, which no rational company would ever accept. You walked into that room, presented terms that would stake their entire company on our judgment, and acted surprised when they refused to commit corporate suicide. That's not negotiating. That's bullying. "Stanley will hear about this," she threatened. "Good," I said, my voice steady now. "Because I have documentation of everything. Every term you insisted on that violated industry standards. Every warning I gave that you ignored. Every time you overruled reasonable compromise in favor of aggressive tactics. If Stanley wants to understand why we just lost $43 million and damaged our reputation with one of the best suppliers in the industry, I'd be happy to explain." Helen's eyes narrowed. "You kept records?" "I'm a negotiator, Helen. Documentation is what I do. Every email. Every meeting summary. Every revision you demanded. Every projection I made about likely outcomes. It's all timestamped and saved." Her face went pale. She realized, perhaps for the first time, that she'd left a paper trail of terrible judgment. She left without another word. I sat back down, heart pounding. I'd just threatened my director with evidence of her incompetence. This was probably the end of my career at Point Technologies. But I was done being silent. I was done watching good work destroyed by ego. 20 minutes later, Stanley's assistant called. He wanted to see me immediately. I gathered my files, 3 months of emails, memos, draft contracts showing the evolution of terms, correspondence with Gordon's team, my warnings about Helen's approach, and the financial projections I'd compiled showing the cost of losing Westford. I organized everything chronologically, added a table of contents, and prepared myself for termination. I walked to the executive floor expecting to be fired. Stanley was waiting in his office with our general counsel, Francine Oakes, and our VP of operations, Lloyd Hartman. Helen was not present. That was interesting. "Sit down, Claudia," Stanley said. He looked tired, older than I'd seen him. There were dark circles under his eyes. "Walk me through what happened with Westford." "Start from the beginning." I did. I showed them the original terms I'd negotiated, the framework Gordon and I had built through 6 weeks of productive discussions. I explained how those terms aligned with industry standards and created a sustainable partnership. I showed Helen's revisions, each one more aggressive than the last. I showed my warnings, my concerns, the memo I'd sent that had gone unanswered. I showed the final liability clause that had broken the deal, comparing it to standard industry language and explaining why no supplier would accept unlimited liability for client mistakes. Lloyd was taking notes, his expression growing darker with each page. "Why didn't you come to me directly?" Stanley asked. "I did," I said, pulling up the email I'd sent weeks earlier. "I copied you on this memo outlining my concerns about liability terms and aggressive negotiation tactics. I included financial projections and warned that Westford would walk if we pushed too hard." I never received a response. He winced. "I get hundreds of emails daily. My assistant filters them. I must have missed it." "Helen didn't miss it," I said, showing him her response. "She told me I was undermining her, that I was disloyal, and that I cared too much about fairness. She said if I couldn't negotiate aggressively, maybe I was in the wrong role." Francine leaned forward. "Do you still have contact with Gordon Fletcher?" "I think so. We had a good relationship before Helen took over. He texted me after the walkout, actually. Said he was sorry this happened and that I deserved better." Lloyd raised his eyebrows. "He blamed leadership, not you?" "He understood what happened. Gordon's been in business 30 years. He recognized the signs of internal conflict." "Call him," Stanley said. "See if he'll meet with you." "Without Helen?" "Without anyone else. Just you and Gordon's team. Can you salvage this?" I blinked. "You want me to try to rebuild the deal?" "I want you to do what you should have been allowed to do in the first place, negotiate a fair deal that serves both companies." Relief flooded through me, followed immediately by doubt. "Stanley, Helen is my director. She'll never allow." "Helen is on administrative leave as of this morning," Francine interrupted. When Westford's termination letter arrived, we started reviewing the negotiation files. "Your documentation has been very enlightening. We've also discovered that Westford wasn't the only problematic negotiation she's handled." Administrative leave. The words hung in the air like smoke. "We're still investigating," Stanley continued, "but preliminary findings suggest Helen prioritized aggressive tactics over sustainable partnerships in multiple negotiations, not just Westford. The Castleton medical deal fell through last month. The Riverstone supply contract was signed but they've already given termination notice. Your situation brought it to our attention, but the pattern extends further back." Lloyd added, "I've been getting complaints from operations about supplier reliability issues. When I looked into it, I found that 3 suppliers have terminated relationships in the past 6 months. They all cited impossible contract terms and adversarial treatment. Helen negotiated all 3 agreements." I didn't know what to say. Part of me felt vindicated. Part of me just felt exhausted and sad. This was bigger than one bad deal. This was systemic damage. "Call Gordon," Stanley repeated. "Explain what happened. Be honest. Be transparent. See if we can rebuild trust. You have my full authority to negotiate whatever terms are necessary. Fair terms. Sustainable terms. No interference." I called Gordon that afternoon from my office. My hands were shaking as I dialed, uncertain what I'd say or how he'd respond. The phone rang 3 times. "Claudia," he answered, his voice cautious but not hostile. "Gordon, I need to tell you what happened. You deserve to understand." I told Gordon everything, how Helen had overridden my recommendations, how I'd tried to defend the fair terms we created, and how I'd been pushed out of the final meeting. I apologized for not warning him sooner, explaining that I'd been trapped between internal politics and honoring our partnership. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he admitted he'd suspected something was wrong. The shift around week 8 had been too abrupt. Agreements we'd aligned on suddenly favored point technologies, and once I vanished from the negotiations, he assumed I'd been overruled. He even told his team I'd likely fought the changes. Hearing that stung. Gordon then described how the final terms weren't just tough, they were unreasonable. Helen had demanded Westford assume unlimited liability for decisions we controlled. When he pushed back, she accused them of being unreliable. I winced, it was worse than I knew. I told him Helen was off the project and that our CEO wanted me to resume negotiations with full authority and no interference. After a pause, Gordon said he'd review the fair version we'd built weeks earlier. His board was angry, but he was willing to see if trust could be rebuilt. It was more than I expected. I promised transparency, fairness, and steady collaboration, everything the process had lacked once Helen intervened.